People are hearing a lot of crazy lies from Donald Trump about voting by mail. You are a journalist who spent more time on this topic than just about anyone. How safe is voting by mail?
The president has engaged in a massive propaganda effort around vote by mail, calling it rigged and dangerous and fraudulent. But in fact, vote by mail is very safe. The Conservative Heritage Foundation, which is a close ally of Donald Trump, found only 143 criminal convictions for mail ballot fraud over the past 20 years. So that equals 0.00006% of fraud out of total votes cast. So you can see it's not a very big problem.
This is a practice that has gone on for so long in this country that the idea that it's some new thing that we should worry about is just absurd, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Voting by mail is going to be used in larger numbers than ever before, but it's not a new invention. It's not like we invented vote by mail in the year 2020. States like Oregon have been doing it for a few decades now. The military has been voting by mail for decades. Overseas voters have been voting by mail for decades. So we have a lot of data on this. We have data that shows that vote by mail doesn't lead to large-scale voter fraud. We have data that people like using vote by mail, and we have data that vote by mail increases voter turnout. So we're going to see an expansion of vote by mail, but there's not going to be anything really different in terms of how it works this year than how it's worked in years past.
In fact, I believe there's some people who voted by mail in the past who live and work in the White House. Isn't that right?
Imagine that. According to the Washington Post, there are 16 top Trump administration officials, including Trump himself, that have voted by mail. So you have Trump voting by mail. You have Pence voting by mail. You have Attorney General Barr voting by mail. You have Kellyanne Conway voting by mail. I'm not going to read the whole list, but on and on and on you go. Basically, every top member of the Trump administration has voted by mail. And Trump is trying to create this crazy distinction between vote by mail, mail ballots, and absentee voting. But they're the same thing. It's people voting by mail. I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to say that states should not make it easy to vote by mail, that states should not, for example, mail ballots to every registered voter, like Oregon does, like Washington does, like California is going to do this year. In my view, that's actually what we should be doing. If you look at the data, the best way to do vote by mail is to have it be universal and to send a ballot to every registered voter. And I think Trump is so afraid of that because that way of voting by mail is going to lead to the largest increase in voter turnout because it's going to get ballots in the easiest way to the largest number of voters.
So 2020 will be the first time that a lot of people vote by mail. How easy is it to do that right now?
It's very easy to vote by mail in most states. In 7 states in the country, ballots are mailed to every registered voter. So you'll actually get a ballot where you live if you're registered. You won't have to do anything to get it. And that's really the gold standard. That's what Oregon and Washington and California, states like that, are going to do. In 34 states, you can request an absentee ballot for any reason. That means that anybody in those states can vote by mail, and that includes basically every swing state in the country. So in all of the states that are going to decide the next presidential election, people will easily be able to vote by mail. Then there's about 10 other states in which you have to have an excuse to vote by mail. Most of those states allowed you to vote by mail due to coronavirus in the primaries. And the hope is that they'll allow you to do that in the general. Now, there are some notable exceptions where it's very, very difficult to vote by mail. One of those places is Texas, where, for example, if you're over 65, you can vote by mail for any reason. But if you're under 65, you can't actually cite fear of contracting COVID as a reason to vote by mail, which I just think is so absolutely, totally insane. The Republican Attorney General there has said that fear of contracting COVID is an emotional condition, not a physical condition, even though there are 10,000 cases a day in Texas right now. So in a few states like Texas, Republicans have created a situation where it's easy for their voters to be able to vote by mail, particularly voters over 65. And it's harder for Democrats, those under 65, to be able to vote by mail. But the good news is that in most of the country, anyone can vote by mail, and it's very easy to do so.
What do we know about voter turnout in states where there's a lot of voting by mail?
We know that voter turnout increases when you make it easy to vote by mail. So just look at what happened in the primaries. 4 of the 5 states with the highest increases in voter turnout mailed ballots to all registered voters. So that policy works. In 13 of the 15 states with the highest voter turnout in the primaries, 60% or more of the electorate voted by mail. So what we're seeing is that in states with high turnout, a lot of people decide to vote by mail because that's the safest way to vote in a pandemic. And I think that's what the Trump administration is so afraid of. They're afraid of the fact that there will be unprecedented voter turnout in November, and that voters will decide to cast ballots by mail because it's the safest way to do so, and they think that's going to hurt their voters, even though, in my view, Republicans are just as likely, if not more likely, to want to vote by mail as Democrats will be.
That was going to be my next question, is I've seen a lot of stories recently that Republican operatives in various states are now trying to tell the White House, stop having the president attack vote by mail, because they want vote by mail because they believe that if more of their voters get ballots to mail in, they will have better turnout in Republican sections of certain places in America.
Absolutely. If you look at who the GOP's core voters are, they are older, more rural voters that are going to need vote by mail more than just about anybody. And so what President Trump is doing by trying to dissuade people to vote by mail is he's essentially disenfranchising his own voters. And that's why Republicans in Wisconsin and Florida and all of these states are saying, no, we actually want people to vote by mail. And they really reached an absurd level in Florida, John. You may have seen this mailer that was done by the Florida Republican Party, where they took a tweet from President Trump that says, absentee voting is good. And they highlighted that, and then they blurred out the part where he said mail voting is bad. So, I mean, they are doing quite the jujitsu here, trying to finesse this issue. And what we're seeing is that in states like Florida, Democrats have now a huge advantage in terms of requesting mail ballots. And that's a big reversal because in Arizona and Florida and other swing states, Republicans were ahead when it came to vote by mail. They've completely lost that advantage because of what the president has been saying.
Are there any drawbacks of vote by mail that you've seen?
Yeah, so vote by mail isn't perfect. There are a few things to keep an eye on. One thing is the fact that if you don't turn your ballot in on time, it can be rejected. So in the primaries so far, 65,000 absentee ballots have been rejected because they arrived too late. Now, that's not that big of a number. That's only 1% of total ballots cast. However, if the election is close, you have to keep an eye on, are these ballots being returned in time? So I would urge everyone who wants to vote by mail, make sure you request your mail ballot early and make sure you send it back early, because the closer to the election you get in terms of requesting it, that's going to put more stress on election officials. That's going to put more stress on the Postal Service. Another potential drawback of vote by mail is ballots can be rejected if you don't sign them, for example. If you don't sign them neatly, they might be thrown out because of things like mismatched signatures. So you have to be careful when you vote by mail. Some states have very strict laws about this. So voting by mail, I think, is really good, particularly in a pandemic, but you have to be careful in terms of how you do it. You have to request a ballot early. You have to fill it out carefully. And to me, all of the rules governing mail voting are a reason why we should make mail voting easier, not harder, because there are already a lot of rules surrounding mail voting. And if they become more restrictive, not less restrictive, fewer people are going to use it as a result.
I've talked to a lot of folks on the Democratic side who say that as much as we want to make vote by mail much easier and universally accessible, really, that they also want to preserve some in-person voting options that are safe for the fall, because there are a number of Democratic constituencies or people who tend to vote Democratic, and this is especially true apparently of a lot of black voters who don't have a lot of trust in vote by mail, partly because of voter suppression efforts over the years, and they worry that their ballot somehow won't be counted, and so they actually want to go vote in person. Do you think it's important to sort of preserve these in-person voting opportunities for people in the fall, even as we may be dealing with COVID?
Yeah, I think in-person voting is still really important. I don't think it's either or. I don't think you vote by mail or you vote in person. You have to have both options. And we've clearly seen that in the primaries, because one of the most disturbing things that happen in the primaries is there's been very long lines to vote. 5-hour lines in Wisconsin, 6-hour lines in Georgia, 7-hour lines in Nevada. And one of the reasons why the lines were so long is because so many polling places were closed. And so these states were encouraging people to vote by mail, but they weren't preserving enough polling places. And what happened was you either had constituencies that wanted to vote in person, or you had constituencies that didn't get their mail ballots for one reason or another. And if you don't get a mail ballot, your only recourse is to go vote in person. And so I think we should expect that in November, we're going to see unprecedented mail voting, but a lot of people are still going to want to vote in person. And it's going to be critically important to have enough polling places. And I think one thing is also really important is that to make sure there's enough poll workers, because poll workers tend to be older. I saw a statistic that 58% of poll workers are 60 or over. So they're the highest risk category. So if you're young, if you feel like you're in a safe enough position, I would encourage people to become poll workers, because if you don't want your polling place to close, someone has to be able to staff the polls who's not at risk and willing to do this kind of work.
Yeah, we're trying to do that this week as well, is to try to make sure as many people as possible who are young and healthy can sign up to be poll workers, so that a lot of people who are elderly and at risk don't have to do that. One of the most important things, obviously, we need for vote by mail to be successful is a working post office. Trump has been trying to screw that up too. What worries you about how he's treated the U.S. Postal Service and sort of the state of the U.S. Postal Service right now as we head into this election?
I'm very concerned about what the Trump administration is doing to the post office. They named the former top fundraiser for the Republican convention as Postmaster General, which is totally unprecedented to put such a partisan person in that position. He recently announced major changes to the post office. One of the things the Trump administration is trying to do is to eliminate overtime for postal workers, and also to say that they don't have to deliver packages the same day. So what's that going to mean? That's going to mean that postal workers are not going to be able to work as many hours, and mail is not going to be able to be delivered as efficiently in the middle of a pandemic in which you're going to see unprecedented vote by mail. So I don't think it's a coincidence that suddenly the Trump administration is attacking and politicizing the post office at the very moment when vote by mail is more important than ever. I think they are using the post office as a vehicle for voter suppression. And that's why it's so important that Congress funds the post office. Congress has already given the post office $10 billion, but the post office hasn't been able to access that money because Steve Mnuchin is putting all of these considerations on them using the funds. So that's insane. They're not even able to use the money that they've already gotten. And also, they are running out of money. And one of the things Democrats did in the HEROES Act, which they passed in May, they included $25 billion for the post office. And so the post office says they need that money or they're going to run out of it. And to me, again, this should not be a partisan issue. Just as in the same way that Republicans vote by mail, Republicans get mail. I mean, like, there's not an inherent bias when it comes to mail. And again, a lot of Republicans live in rural areas where they absolutely rely on the post office. So this is one issue where it seems like there should be some sort of bipartisan agreement that we need the post office in general, and we specifically need it in an election in which vote by mail is going to be used at unprecedented numbers.
So, as you said earlier, in the swing states that will decide the election, it does seem like voting by mail is accessible in all those states without an excuse. Now that we've been through most of the primaries and we're looking towards the fall, and you've been covering a lot of the voting problems that we've had in these primaries, what sort of worries you the most as we look to the fall about ensuring voting access in November?
What worries me is we've never done this before. We've never had a presidential election in a pandemic to begin with. And then we've never had people vote by mail in such large numbers. So during the primaries, for example, in Wisconsin, they went from 6% of people voting by mail to 60% of people voting by mail, which is just an unbelievable increase from one election to the other. And election officials were overwhelmed. The post office was overwhelmed. Voters were confused by the process. And now voter turnout is going to be 2 to 3 times higher in all of these key swing states than it was during the primaries. So I'm worried that even if everyone is well-intentioned about this process, the system could just get overwhelmed by the volume of mail voting. That's one thing that concerns me. The other thing is that clearly there are people that don't want this process to go well, that the Republican Party has been engaged in a very long effort, you could say a 50-year long effort, to try to suppress voters. Certainly, it's accelerated since the 2010 election when all of these new restrictions on voting went into effect in places like Ohio and North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And they're going to double down on those efforts during a pandemic. And the Republican Party is currently trying to weaponize coronavirus to make voting more difficult. They're trying to make it more difficult to vote by mail. They're also trying to make it more difficult to vote in person. The good news is that in the primaries, a lot of these efforts seem to have backfired, that there's been record voter turnout so far. And so I'm hopeful that people are going to be so motivated to vote that they're going to be able to overcome whatever barriers are put in front of them. But I also think that in the way that we saw high turnout in Georgia and high turnout in Wisconsin, voter suppression efforts could actually motivate people to vote and say to people, if my vote didn't matter, why are they trying so hard to suppress it?
I'll tell you one thing that keeps me up at night that I actually think we can all have an effect on by educating people about it now is, in 2018, for example, Arizona's a state that has a lot of vote by mail. On election night, it seemed like Kyrsten Sinema was behind Martha McSally. A lot of networks didn't think that she was going to win, right? We didn't know that she was going to win. A couple days later, she ends up winning by 2 or 3 points because it took time to count these ballots. I have a fear that with so much voting by mail, some of these states on election night will look closer than they will end up, and Donald Trump may even declare victory in some of these states. And I worry that sort of the reporters covering these races won't really price in the fact that in a couple of days the outstanding ballots may favor Joe Biden or the Democratic candidate, and this could start causing the trouble where Trump declares victory when he didn't win at all. Is that something you're worried about, or is that just sort of a fear that I have?
I'm incredibly worried about that scenario, and it's completely plausible to me because one of the effects of Trump urging Republicans to vote in person is that in-person ballots are counted sooner than mail ballots in most states, because in a lot of states, ballots don't have to arrive till election day or after. And so that means that it takes longer to count mail ballots. So you could have a situation where more Republicans are voting in person and their ballots are counted sooner, and more Democrats are voting by mail and their ballots are being counted later. And so it makes it seem like there's a lot more Republican votes than Democratic votes, when in fact it just takes longer to count the Democratic votes. So I think that's absolutely possible in a lot of key states, that the Republicans could be up early, but the Democrats are going to be up when all votes are counted. And that's just going to be because votes are being counted, but Republicans are going to do everything they can, just like they did in Arizona, just like they did in California in 2018, saying the system is fraudulent, saying it's rigged. And I think that's why it's on all of us as journalists, in addition to election officials, saying we're not going to declare any kind of winners until all the votes, or at least enough of the votes, are counted. Wisconsin's election in April was a complete disaster, but one of the things they did well was they just held all the results for a week until all the ballots were counted. And so therefore there was no speculation on election night. Everyone knew that the results were coming out a week later. There was nothing untoward about it. And on a week later, the ballots were counted and we knew who the winners were. And so I think we need to have some sort of agreement on this now. And I think all of the major institutions in America that have credibility, whether it's local election officials, the media, other government agencies outside of the Trump administration, have to start educating people about this, because you're completely right that Trump's going to do whatever he can to try to delegitimize the result, especially if it looks like he might lose.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important that everyone in a position of influence, who is a reporter, who is a journalist, and this doesn't have to be partisan, right? Like, we have to socialize the idea now with the American public that it may not be election night, it may be election week. And that we're all just going to have to go to bed on election night without the results, without knowing who won the election. And that we're in the middle of a pandemic, that just may be what we have to do this year.
There's another scenario that also worries me a lot, which is the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
We've already seen a number of decisions from the Supreme Court that have put in effect bad voting laws for the primaries. So they've put in place restrictions in Florida and Alabama, in Wisconsin and Texas. Pretty much consistently, the Supreme Court has intervened in 2020 to say that Republicans can basically put in effect any restrictions on voting they want, even in a pandemic. So what worries me is there's all of this litigation about the rules of mail voting. When do ballots need to be postmarked by? Do the signatures have to absolutely match? Those kind of things. And if the election is really close in certain states, you can absolutely imagine that this stuff is going to be litigated to the Supreme Court. And I'm very concerned if we have a Florida 2000 situation where it's 537 votes or a few thousand votes in a number of key swing states, it's going to go to the court. And the court in that case will say that the Republicans are going to prevail and Donald Trump is going to be elected. I really hope that doesn't happen, but unfortunately, there's already a precedent for that in this country. And when it comes to voting rights, John Roberts is not a swing vote. And I think it's really, really important for people to understand that. This is the guy who authored the majority decision gutting the Voting Rights Act. This is the guy that said federal courts can't review gerrymandering. This is the guy that said that states can do aggressive voter purging. So he's not a swing vote when it comes to voting rights. And basically, what I hope is, number one, the election isn't close, but number two, that we know what the rules are ahead of time. And there's agreement on that so that the Supreme Court doesn't, again, decide the winner of the election like they did in 2000.
So, Ari, for people listening right now who want to make sure that they can vote, that their friends can vote, that their vote will be counted, what would you suggest?
I would suggest that they request their ballot early, so they're not worrying about it arriving in time, that they send it back early so they're not worrying about whether it will be counted, that they fill it out carefully. Make sure to sign your ballot. Make sure that you sign it carefully. Make sure you understand what all the rules are so that your ballot isn't thrown out. I think if we do that, if people request it early and are careful about filling it out, I think we're going to see very high mail turnout and hopefully all of the ballots are counted.
And for everyone listening, you can go to votesaveamerica.com, and we will have everything you need there to request your ballot, to get information about your ballot, and all kinds of voter information. So check out votesaveamerica.com, and like Ari said, get that ballot early.